Tales of Venison Jack, Part 6. A Feast in the Forest. There was much rejoicing in Waldenham. Not only had Venison Jack, Edgar and Edmund been saved from the gallows, but Ermengarde had been delivered from the lustful clutches of Reynold, and was going to be married to Gilbert Goosefeather. Venison Jack went out and shot one of Robert Sonk-Su's deer, and then invited the villagers to join him and the woods warders for a celebratory feast. Responsibility for the catering fell upon Mildred, a woman of uncertain status who lived with the woods warders and looked after their needs, culinary and otherwise. She was hard at work, roasting a pig, baking venison pasties, stirring a cauldron of pottage, and worrying whether there was adequate ale. And there were plenty of thirsty throats requiring refreshment. Wilfred arrived, along with Olwyn and Erwin, Maud too with her sewing. Ermengarde came along, accompanied by an adoring Gilbert Goosefeather. Several of the woods warders were out of action following their recent encounters with the Normans, but plodding Peter and wide-eyed Osric joined Venison Jack at the festivities. Egbert and Edmund had recovered from the wounds that had been inflicted upon them by Robert Sonk-Su's sword and the hooves of his horse. Reunited with Edgar, Ethel and Edith, the family had taken shelter in the forest with the woods warders, and now mingled with the throng. Everyone was having a great time, until the Normans put in an appearance. Robert Sonk-Su and his men had most definitely not been invited to the festivities. Maybe this rankled with him. Maybe he wanted revenge for recent defeats. Maybe he was just a nasty piece of work. Whatever the reason, he determined to crash the party and spoil the fun. His plan was simple. Along with Black Hubert, he would ride headlong into the mass of partygoers and slaughter as many of them as he could manage. Limping William the spearman would follow up on foot and provide any support necessary. Finally, he would station his 2 crossbowmen, Martin and Guy, in the trees at the edge of the dell, where they could shoot down anyone who tried to escape. The result would be a show of force that would cow the natives and eliminate the elements that had been causing him so much trouble. The first the Saxons knew of Robert's plan was when they heard the thundering hooves of his horse, and then he was upon them, sword flashing. Erwin fell to the ground in a pool of blood. There was screaming and panic. Venison Jack was the first to react. He hurled himself at Robert, slashing with his dagger at the mounted Norman towering above him, not without some effect. But his counterattack was curtailed by the arrival of Black Hubert, who laid Jack's scalp open with a well-directed spear thrust. And now Edmund spotted the crossbowman lurking in the trees and loosed an arrow at Martin, who ducked back into the foliage. The arrow went wide. Guy reacted by shooting a bolt at Edmund. His aim was better, but the resulting wound was not serious. Robert Sonk-Su was now raising his sword to strike Ethel and the child, Edith. Edgar came to their aid, stabbing with his spear, and then grabbing at Robert, pulling him out of the saddle. Then wide-eyed Osric piled in, bludgeoning Black Hubert, bruising him even through his hauberk. And still more Saxons joined the melee. Next was Olwyn with his trusty quarterstaff. As the dismounted Robert rose to his feet, Olwyn gave him a sharp tap over the head, which rendered him senseless. Enthused by this result, Osric once more raised his club to strike again at Hubert. But now Hubert was prepared. Before Osric could take his swing, Hubert's spear ran him through. Osric's place was soon filled. Up stepped Egbert, a much more formidable foe. His axe was stout and sharp, and its blade bit deep. That was that for Black Hubert. The Normans in the trees were making a nuisance of themselves. A crossbow bolt embedded itself in Edgar's shield, and another narrowly missed his father. Edgar charged across the dell, intending to teach the crossbowmen a lesson. His father and Olwyn followed at a more sedate pace. The Saxon womenfolk headed in the opposite direction, away from danger. Having observed the falls of Robert and Hubert, William had decided not to follow them to the same fate. Instead, he sought concealment in the trees and safety in numbers, heading over to join Martin and Guy. He arrived at the same time as Edgar, who was crossing swords with Martin. William's arrival tipped the balance. That was Edgar out of the fight. But his father had now arrived on the scene. Egbert did not take kindly to folk who injured his elder son, and with Olwyn's support he beat the Normans back from where Edgar's blooded body lay helpless on the grass. Despite his freely bleeding head, Venison Jack had now organised the Saxon archers, and they all began loosing arrows at Guy. But Guy had concealed himself behind a tree, and so their arrows all missed. Meanwhile, Egbert and Olwyn continued to fight with Martin and William. The combat went back and forth. Blood was shed on all sides. But eventually, Olwyn managed to land a couple of hearty blows on Martin, driving him back into the trees, where he took cover. This allowed Olwyn and Egbert to gang up on William, who, despite his gammy leg, put up a stout resistance, but ultimately fell beneath the blade of Egbert's axe. Still the Saxon archers rained arrows into the trees, where Guy and Martin still lurked, and still they failed to do any damage. As Egbert and Olwyn advanced upon the crossbowmen, Venison Jack ordered the archers forward in support. Maybe cold steel could force a decision where arrows had failed to do so. But even as the archers reached the forest edge, Egbert's axe struck a third time, and Guy had breathed his last. Martin fled, seeking safety in the depths of the forest. But he did not get far. Venison Jack drew his bow and loosed a single arrow. Straight and true it flew, and struck Martin right between the shoulder blades, piercing his gambeson coat and his heart. That was the end of the affair. The woods warders and the villagers returned to their feast. Brother Bevis, who had arrived late to the party and therefore missed the fight, made himself useful by uniting Gilbert Goosefeather and Ermengarde in holy matrimony, and they all lived happily ever after. Or did they?